how to choose a camera system that's right for you. There are a few things that all photographers will need to consider when choosing a new camera system. First of all, price. Of course, there are limitations to what each individual can afford. The next is lens choices. That is, does that system have the lenses that are useful to the type of photography you want to do? Also, do they produce lenses of a high enough quality? You can check this with information, for example, from MTF charts, modular transfer function charts. And we've got another great video that goes into the specifics of lens quality and things like diffraction. Another consideration will be focusing speed. This can be very important for some photographers in certain genres. Another one is durability. Some photographers need a camera that's very robust and durable so they can use on location in harsh conditions, outdoors, for landscape, wildlife, those sort of things. Then the genre of the photography that you are going to be undertaking is super important. For example, if it's sport or wildlife, you might need a camera that can shoot very fast frames per second to capture those sequences of action. But if you're shooting portrait or fashion, your considerations for the camera system might be completely different. If you're shooting product, you may have considerations more to do with detail and resolution, or landscape, it may be going back to durability. Ergonomics and size is another important factor in a photographer's decision. How the camera feels in your hand, how big it is, and the type of photography that you're going to be doing dictates the camera that you're going to be carrying around. Does it feel right? Is it the right size? And is it going to work for you as maybe a traveling photographer? Another consideration is tech. Things like frame rates, flash sync speed, ISO range, auto bracketing, shooting modes, metering modes, and all of that technology that is contained in today's modern cameras. Now, to a photographer like me, a lot of that isn't actually relevant. I'm just going to use a camera in full manual mode. All cameras have really three functions: a shutter, an aperture, and ISO. Beyond that, everything else on the camera, all of that tech, really just adjusts and changes those three settings. The most important thing to me is actually image quality. We have another video that discusses image quality and the various factors that affect it. But one of the most important things you should be looking at when deciding on a new camera system is whether or not you can test them.
It's time. One destiny.
Let's get ready to rumble!
So as a product and advertising photographer, my ultimate requirement is image quality. So I've selected 3 cameras that I know would fulfill this requirement. The Hasselblad H6, which I used for many years, the Hasselblad X2D, and the Sony A135mm camera. Now obviously I couldn't test all cameras because there are too many on the market and we don't have access to all of those cameras. So the first thing I'm going to do is to zoom in on this third square down. We're currently on the Hasselblad H6 shot, and we can also confirm that by looking in the EXIF data, and we can see which camera and settings, etc. there. But what I want to do is neutralize onto this square here. So I'm going to go into the neutralize tool, neutralize there, so you can see that warmed that up a little bit. I'm going to go to the next shot, do the same, the next shot, do the same, and the next shot to do the same there. Now, the other thing I want to be sure is that the exposure is the same. If we look at the information down this bottom corner here, you can see I've got RGB values here, and the RGB values for this third square down are 130 in this particular shot, or around about 130. They are 132, 131, which is less than a tenth of an f-stop, so we're not worried about that. And on this one, they're 122. So this shot is slightly darker, and that's because every camera is a little bit different in how it records light or its aperture opening or those sort of small things. But I want to get this one to read 130 as well, or I want to get the first one to read 120. So this is reading 123, 124. Let's check the next one. That one's reading 131, 132. So let's say then this one is out in exposure. So I'm going to bring it up in exposure ever so slightly. Check the measurements again on that square. They're now 130, 131, so that's absolutely perfect. So all four of these shots, that's 2 Hasselblad H6 shots and 2 Hasselblad X2D shots, are now all reading 130 and are neutralized in that third square. We're now going over to Capture One, to the Sony image files, and I'm going to zoom in to that area, and I'm going to pan across. And third square down, neutralizing that shot. And the readings are at the top for this one. You can see those. Oops, you can't see them when I move the mouse away, but I think you can see those just up there at the top. So the readings there are 117. So this is too dark. The next one, let's neutralize. That's neutralized. The readings are 120. And the next one, neutralize. The readings on this one are 125, 126. So we're going to just go into the settings. These minor adjustments in exposure on a raw file have no bearing on the quality, won't affect the quality of the image whatsoever. So we're going to take that exposure up a little bit. Let's take another reading. That's 129, so that's as good as 130. So that's very, very close on that last shot. Let's go to the next one. This one's going to have to go up a little bit. 17, yeah, that's 129, 130 now. 130 exactly on that one. Now I could modify the next one to match that, but I'll just do it manually. 129 on that one, 130 on the other one. Let's just jump to the first image. And that one is still reading 117, so we're going to take that up. 129, so that's close enough. So they're all now, the Hasselblad images from the H6 and the X2D and the Sony are now all the same color balance and all the same exposure level, which will give us a fairer comparison. Now, the first thing I want to do is to decide which Hasselblad has given me the best result. And then when I've decided whether it's the H6 or the X2D image files that are the best result, I already know based on previous experience which one I expect it to be, but whichever one it is going to be, I'll then compare that against the Sony A1 files. So I'll move back to the Hasselblad software. We're now currently looking at the H6, and this particular shot is at f11, and the next shot is at f16. Now, we shot on the Sony, this is very important to understand for fairness, we shot on the Sony at f11. We shot on the Hasselblad at f11. But depth of field on a medium format camera is different. It's shallower than on a 35mm camera. So we also shot at f16 on the medium format camera to bring the depth of field to match that of the Sony at f11. But that is actually negative for the Hasselblad, because as you shoot a smaller aperture, you bring diffraction into the problem. And if you're interested in learning all about diffraction, we've got a great video on diffraction that will tell you everything you need to know about that. So shooting at f16 on the Hasselblad is actually a negative, but we just took a shot at f16 as a depth of field comparison to f11 on a Sony. Anyway, let's get back to it. So f11 on the Sony, on the Hasselblad H6, f16 on the Hasselblad H6, f16 on the Hasselblad X2D, and then f11 on the Hasselblad X2D. So I'm going to start comparing f11 on the X2D against f11 on the H6. So let's take a look. So the first thing we're going to do is zoom in on the image. The focus point was on this Alpine Star logo. And I'm going to take a look. This is at 200%. And that's 200% on the H6 image. So I'm looking at the detail in the boot. The material of the boot up here looks very good on the H6. I'm going to jump across to the X2D. You can see it looks slightly sharper on the X2D, especially in that textured area. Just got a little bit more bite, a little bit more crispness in there. I'm going to move over to the color checker card here. You can see the little markings along here give a good indication of detail. So we're on the X2D at the moment at f11, jumping to the H6. You can see those are a little bit softer, a little bit of chromatic aberration on those markers, and not quite as sharp overall there on the H6. That's the X2D. There's a little bit of difference in positioning because the camera sensors are slightly different sizes, but that's nothing really much to do with it. I'm going to look at tonal range now. So I'm looking at the sort of richness of tones running across this red stripe and these two blue stripes. So I'm on the X2D, looks really, really nice. Going back to the H6. The H6 looks quite a bit more orange on that red stripe compared to the actual helmet itself. Tonal range is good though, but I think it looks a little bit smoother and more silky on the X2D. There's also a little bit more crispness in there overall, and this is on the f11 shot. So overall, let's move down here to this area. Again, yeah, it's just a little bit fuzzier in this area on here. The writing on the sign, let's take a look at that. It's much crisper on the X2D shot than on the H6, which is what I expected given it's a more modern camera with more modern lenses and a more modern lens design, etc. So for me, we're going to compare these two X2D shots. Let me just go to 5-star images. So these are my two X2D shot, Hasselblad medium format. And now let's go over to the Sony camera and we'll start to make some comparisons. So first of all, we're just going to move into our area of focus around here. We'll move to our first shot. Let's just zoom out a second. So we're going to zoom into that same area. Now the Sony is a 50 megapixel camera, which means that the image file is going to have to come to about 300% in magnification to give the same representation of image scale if you were making a print. Okay, so we've got both files open. I have the Hasselblad X2D shot at f11 and the Sony file shot at f11 as well. Now that puts the Hasselblad medium format file at a slight disadvantage on depth of field, because remember, f11 on a Sony 35mm camera will be more like f16 on a Hasselblad, and if we were to use f16 from the Hasselblad, we might be also suffering a little bit of diffraction. So we're going to go with f11, both files at f11, but you might notice in some places that the Sony files got a little bit of depth of field advantage. If that's the case, we'll check and review the f16 version on the Hasselblad. Now, we are at 100% on the Sony file there in that magnification, and we're also at 100% on the Hasselblad file. But we have a complete disparity between the resolution of two cameras here. One is a 50 megapixel resolution, 35mm full frame, and the other is a 100 megapixel resolution. Now this has come up before, and let's get this clear. If you want to know how an image would reproduce, you need to make both images the same size on screen, not worrying about the percentage of the magnification the actual display size, because that is the same and equivalent to blowing both images up as prints and having them printed to the same physical size. So you might blow those prints up to 2 meters wide each, and of course that's the same as one of the files being 300% and the other one being 200%, because there's more resolution in one file to begin with. And it's the same for billboards or digital billboards or screens, etc., televisions, anything like that. If you want to compare the actual resolution, essentially, both images have to be the same physical size on screen. Because when we look at them here, we have captured the same physical area in both shots. So we're looking at, there you go, the two shots are the same. So we blow them up the same, but one of them is going to hit 100% earlier than the other because it's less resolution. But that just shows us what would happen if we were reproducing it on big billboard screens or big billboard prints, etc., like that. So we're going to take this one up to 200% to start with. And this one we need to take up to 100% to match the same size. But actually I'm going to take this up to 200% to get us a little bit more into the detail so we can see what we're dealing with. Now if I do that, of course this image is smaller than that image. So if you want to see a really true comparison of resolution, then we need to take that one to 300%, and now these two are the same. And when we're looking at that, we know that the focus point was exactly on the Alpine Stars logo, and that looks pretty sharp on the Sony, looks a tiny bit sharper on the Hasselblad, but the results are really good on both. If I look at this piece of metal work here, this one's a little bit softer on the Sony, this one's obviously a little bit sharper because it has got that extra resolution, and also I believe the lens quality to be, you know, a little bit superior on the Hasselblad. If we move up a little bit into this is a really good area to study here. Good variation in tonal range. So the Sony is handling it really, really well. Some nice tonal range across there. But if we look at the Hasselblad, we can see there's just a little bit more detail in there, a little bit extra sharpness. The tonal range and silkiness feel of the shot feels a little bit better. The actual overall natural color feels a little bit better and purer as well. We've already neutralized the images, remember, but the purity of the white tones in here looks a little bit more clean and a little bit more neutral. They look a little bit warmer on the Sony file in those highlights. Let's move over to some shadow detail before we look at tonal range. So I'm going into that area there, which is completely dark inside the helmet. And this is pitch black inside here. Inside here, we can just see a little bit of texture. So I can just see some of the fabric lining in there and the texture, and another darker line along here of that deeper, darker contour. So this is showing us that the medium format camera has just a little bit more bite and dynamic range, that it's able to get a little bit more detail out of those shadows, which is great. Let's move over to, this will be a really good test, the richness and silkiness of these color tones in this stripe here. Let's move this one into position. So you can see here, the Hasselblad medium format is a clear winner over the 35mm 50 megapixel. The richness of the reds, the richness of the deep blue are superior on the medium format. The contrast on the black to the white is better. This blue tone is actually very, very similar. The two lighter blue tones look fairly similar. But one of the key things you'll notice is the silkiness of tonal transition. So if you look at the way the image tones change in that blue, from your mid-tone blue to your shadow blue, back out to mid-tones into slightly higher highlights, that transitional change is smoother and more silky than it is on the Sony. And it is also smoother and more silky and saturated as it changes transition on the reds as well. So we're getting a lot better color fidelity, color transition. Now I know what many of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, Carl, you're a Hasselblad ambassador. You're bound to say these things about the Hasselblad medium format camera. Well, I'm not bound to. I'm happy to be saying that, because I can clearly see that the image files are better. But what you have to understand for me when making a choice on cameras is, as a commercial photographer, I'm only interested in what is absolutely going to deliver me the best image quality for my clients. If this Sony camera was able to deliver better image files for me, for my clients, than this Hasselblad X2D, then that would be the camera I choose. And that's the only decision part of my process, is based on the image quality. And here is a great example of how I can see the differences in image quality. Don't get me wrong though, this Sony camera is performing incredibly well. I believe they've got a new Sony A1 Mark II now, but I think the sensor is exactly the same in the camera. I may be wrong on that. Let's move along to more detail at the top of the boot. Might show us also on depth of field here. We're on the F11 file there. I'm going to move across here. So I think the DryStar logo is just maybe a little bit crisper on the Sony, ever so slightly, probably because of that depth of field, extra depth of field that you get with the 35mm. The textural information at the top here in the background, again, little bit more smooth but sharper on the medium format file. Look, the real key thing here though is, I hope you can see this. I'm looking at this on a really high quality ISO monitor. Whether or not you're looking at it on the same quality monitor, and the fact that you're looking at it from the internet is going to probably reduce some of what you're seeing to what I'm seeing. But one of the things I want to look at is if you can look and assess the silkiness of tonal range here, how we go transition from shadow, mid-tone to highlight, or mid-tone back to shadow, and again, and then compare it on the Sony. That transitional information isn't quite the same, not quite as pure, not as silky is the best way to describe it. We're going to look at this highlight detail here. This is the brightest highlight on this image, and it is on this image. And one thing that's interesting is that we can see just a tiny bit more punch of highlight where the studio light is reflecting there. And on this one, you can't quite see that. So that means these white tones here are recording slightly darker than this. So I'm going to pull the highlight recovery down to 50, minus 50 on the Sony. You can see that now reveals the reflection of the parabolic light we had shining on there. I'm going to pull the highlight recovery to 50 as well on the Sony file, and that pulls, so the highlight detail is there on both, which is great. Let's pull that highlight detail even more, because one of the things I think we're going to see is that the Sony will go a bit muddier. I'm at 81 now on the Hasselblad. I'm going to pull this one down to 81 as well. And as expected, you see we lose a bit of purity in the highlight detail on the Sony RAW file. The Hasselblad RAW file remains a bit cleaner and a little bit more pure in those whites. So again, that's that dynamic range just being a little bit greater. Right, let's reset those back. Impressive though that Sony result is. So we've set those back on that one, set that back to 0 on that one. Let's move over to the color checker card. Oh, actually, let's just take a look at this fabric. We got a little bit of sort of suede fabric down here at the bottom. And again, just the level of detail flowing through that area by comparison, just a little bit better on the Hasselblad file. Let's move over. We're right over to the side edge of the image now. That's the end of the image there. And we're looking at these markers on the X-Rite color checker card. There we can see the clarity of the medium format file further out to the edge of the frame. So this is detail now in these outer periphery areas. There's a little bit of chromatic aberration starting to happen on the Sony file, and that's with a really good quality, the 90mm G Sony macro lens. There's a little bit of chromatic aberration on that writing there and on the markers on the scale. But if we look at the medium format file, that's not happening in the same way at all. The clarity is much, much better, not only on those markers, but also on the texture on the plastic, as you can see there. Okay, I'm just over on the far right of the image now, on the end of the helmet sun visor. And both are really good. Sony's actually better than I expected it to be, but you can see just that little bit of extra bite and crispness, tonal range in the Hasselblad file. That one, they're both at 200% there as well. If we were to reproduce the Sony up to the same size in a physical print as the Hasselblad, it would have to be there. And then of course in doing that, you can see that that makes the Sony look a little bit softer because it's having to magnify more to match the resolution of the Hasselblad file. So another interesting area. If we look at, like, you know, the things that I look out for is this tonal transitional change in the visor there. Look at that reflection of light going on there, those bluey swirls of light in that plastic here, compared to what's going on over here as well. We've just got an overall little bit extra bit of crispness in that area. Okay, let's look at the writing on the signs that we put at the front here. Should be around here somewhere. So the Sony one, just slightly softer again. The edge of that writing isn't quite as crisp or clear when they're magnified to the same size, which is the same as what would happen if you magnified them as two prints to get to the same size image. That's taken that one back to 200%. Let's take that one back to 100%, and let's zoom out here, 50% on that, which would be 100% equivalent on here. So the Sony is performing really, really well. It's a good result, but the Hasselblad just has that slightly better purity on the tonal range and the color information throughout the general detail and areas of the photograph. So the results on both cameras are really, really good. So the Sony has performed really, really well. It's an excellent 35mm sensor, but there is just a tiny bit more bite and a little bit better clarity and a little bit better tonal transition on the medium format camera. So we can see that comparison between the two. That tells you why I'm choosing that camera for the work that I shoot. So how do I decide on my choice of camera system and why? Well, most of my work is in product photography, and for that I need super high image quality, tonal range and resolution. And I usually choose the medium format cameras from Hasselblad, such as the H6 or now the X2D. But I also work in underwater filming and underwater photography, and for that I need a camera system that will work extremely well in low light. And I use the Sony A7S series of cameras for that. And I use underwater housings with corrected lenses. Now also for action shots or types of photography where medium format is not suited, I now shoot with Sony. And the reason for that is because we also shoot video. And the Sony 35mm camera system for me works really well for video and for stills. Previously, I used to shoot with Canon and I've shot with Nikons as well. In fact, I've shot with many brands over the years, from film cameras such as Mamiya, Sinar, Toyo, all sorts when I was shooting film back in the day. But now my decisions on the camera system I need are completely based on the type of work that I do. And that is it. So what about your choice? Well, you need to make your own decisions. All of this internet trolling over which camera you should choose or why is about as useful as telling someone what car they should buy without knowing their circumstances or requirements. Telling someone they should be driving a Nissan GT or a Ford Focus is completely irrelevant if you're not fully aware of their family size, their ages, and travel requirements. Most people recommend stuff because they like to validate their own decision and prove to themselves that they haven't wasted their own money. So if you're thinking of building a new camera system, then maybe consider some of the points in this video, and hopefully you'll make the choice that is right for you.